Hello, we're speaking with Peter Klein. He is a professor at the University of Missouri, and be sure to check his blog. It's called Organizations and Markets. We're going to be speaking about entrepreneurship because he published a collection of essays on the topic very recently. And thank you.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Can you tell us to begin with, what is the role of the entrepreneur in society?
Sure. It's interesting that you start with that question, because one of the things that distinguishes the Austrian school from most other approaches to economics is precisely that the Austrians give the entrepreneur a central role in the allocation of resources. Now, exactly how that role has been defined is a little bit different depending on which member of the Austrian school you read. So many of your viewers may have read Professor Kerzner's book, Competition and Entrepreneurship, and other works in which he discusses the entrepreneur. Joseph Schumpeter, sort of a fellow traveler of the Austrian school, also wrote much about the entrepreneur and his role in economic development. And of course, Mises, in Human Action, in one place calls the entrepreneur the, quote, the driving force of the market economy. So what is that exactly? The way I see it is, if you step outside the equilibrium world of mainstream economics, firms don't come into existence by themselves. We have production that takes place in an advanced economy. You have higher order goods, as Menger calls them, the factors of production, and the lower order goods that we consume directly. And what an advanced economy does is combines these factors of production in different ways to produce consumer goods, and not just the same consumer goods all the time, but newer and better and cheaper and so on. Well, how is it that those factors get combined? Well, that is the function that is played by the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is the agent who goes out into the factor market, purchases factors of production, assembles them into consumer goods, tries to sell them on the market, and uses monetary profit and loss signals to find out if he or she has been successful. I think that sometimes we don't appreciate how central the entrepreneur is to Mises' thought. Most people studying the Austrian school are familiar with the socialist calculation debate and Mises' argument that you need to have prices to be able to perform economic calculation. Well, remember, who is it who is performing this calculation function? Who is it that's using the numbers contained by market prices to compare benefits and costs and so on? Well, it's a specific kind of economic actor. Namely, it's the entrepreneur. And even in a pure market capitalist system, it's the entrepreneur who is using the tool of economic calculation to figure out what to do, how to use resources to satisfy consumers.
In Spanish, the term entrepreneur is usually mistaken for businessman.
Right.
How is he different from the businessman and from the capitalist?
Yes.
What's the difference between the three?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think in many different languages, there's some ambiguity and some lack of clarity about what all these different functions are. First, let me say that the role of the manager is not very precisely defined in economic theory, and even within the Austrian tradition as well. The way I think of it is, think of management as a kind of labor, right? So you might hire a manager to direct some activities for you, to make some decisions, to supervise, to monitor, and so on. Well, if we think about basic theory, right, capitalists own capital, and they make that capital available for production, and capitalists earn a particular form of income in exchange for lending out their capital, namely interest income. So the way Mises described it is in terms of the so-called marginal productivity theory of distribution. How do we classify or categorize different kinds of income according to the function that is performed in the economy? Well, capital earns interest. Machines and so on, land, other resources that are used in production earn some kind of what Mises called a rental return, or what Rothbard, elaborating Frank Fetter, called a rental price. So a wage is a kind of a rent. Wage is the rent of labor services. You can rent an apartment or rent a car. the payments for the use of a factor of production per period of time are rents, wages, most in particular for labor. The question is, in a world of uncertainty, if we're in equilibrium in Mises' evenly rotating economy, then the prices of factors of production are all bid up to exactly their sort of discounted marginal contributions to the final product, so that the proceeds from selling goods and services are distributed to all the factors. Land gets a land rent, machines get some rental price, capitalists get an interest return, laborers, including managers, get paid wages or salaries. There's nothing left over. However, outside the evenly rotating economy, outside a kind of general equilibrium world in which there's uncertainty, decisions have to be made about how goods and services how factors of production will be used in advance before we know for sure what the final output will be and how much it will be worth and what consumers will be willing to pay. So the return to the entrepreneur, the pure entrepreneurial profit or pure entrepreneurial loss, is the difference between what was paid out in the beginning and what was received in the end minus interest, minus discounting. So profit and loss are a return to bearing uncertainty. So the point is, the manager earns labor income, the capitalist earns an interest return, the entrepreneur earns pure profit and loss. However, in the world of uncertainty, in order to earn this entrepreneurial profit and loss, the entrepreneur has to have some resources that can be invested into production. So in a market economy with uncertainty, the capitalist is always part entrepreneur and the entrepreneur is always part capitalist.
Bringing it back to Latin America, I think one special case of interest, I don't know if you're familiar with it, is the informal economy.
Yes, of course.
What's your take on it?
Sure. Well, I mean, if we simply mean the part of economic activity that takes place outside the formal bureaucratic regulated structure, I mean, these same economic roles, provision of factors for rent, including labor, the lending of money at interest, the investment of resources and so on, I mean, that all takes place in the informal sector too. When it's done in terms of money, then those actors, those producers, those entrepreneurs in the informal sector use economic calculation just as they do in the formal sector. It may be essentially no different except that it isn't regulated and taxed and so on.